All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Sorry while I look all over the place as I get situated. I am on location today, so not home at my usual spot. But welcome, everybody. I'm David Vaillencourt, founder and CEO of the GMP Collective, and I'm really excited to have everybody here joining us live for what is now our 11th episode, where we talk about when things go wrong. And today, we have a really exciting show. We're going to focus on something that maybe sounds a little dry and people take for granted. Labels, truth in labeling, guiding the industry through towards accurate claims and consumer trust is so important. We take for granted with everything from our water bottles to our food at the grocery store to dietary supplements, or even pharmaceuticals that have clear labels around the declaration of the quantity, the active ingredients, the inactive ingredients, branding, you name it. But in the cannabis industry, we like to be a little unique in true fashion. And when you look in the United States marketplace, particularly for the 39 or so states that have medical or some sort of cannabis framework, there's approximately that many of unique ways to conform to provide to labels for your products. And that presents some real challenges. We're not here to talk about one label that's better than another, which state got it right or which got it wrong, but we are here to use the power of the voluntary consensus standards process and talk about an amazing label specification that was created over 3 years of hard work with colleague Darwin Millard, who is the technical contact for that standard, and Chris Fontes, who is an operator that has been using not just this label spec, but our initial standard that predates this, which is the universal symbol around intoxicating cannabinoids. So we've got, I'm going to call it 3 halves of an episode today, where we're going to start off with the first half and go through some Q&A. I'm going to play moderator and bounce some questions off of Darwin and Chris. If folks here in the audience have any questions, please bring them. Use the Q&A function. We got some great questions during the registration that we're going to get to as well. But as things pop up, bring the questions forward and I will do my best to inject them to get them answered live. And then around half an hour in, we're going to switch over to the second part where Chris is actually going to bring up a label that has been recently approved by the city of Utah from his product line. And we're going to compare that with the label specification at ASTM D8449 and go through some of the places where it doesn't exactly line up and how Chris has gotten around that. And we'll have Darwin here to coach us through some of the nuances of this detailed 82-page label specification. So with that, I'd love to invite Chris and Darwin to the table. Darwin, good to see you as always. Can you just, for folks that maybe don't know who Spock is, give a quick 30-second introduction?
All right, yeah, 30 seconds, woo! Thanks, David, for having me here. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be able to present on the latest specification from ASTM's D37 on cannabis. My name is Darwin Millard. I am a mechanical engineer and I am the Chief Science Officer for Final Bell. And I'm also the Vice Chair for the ASTM's D3704 on processing and handling. And the chair for ASTM D3708 on devices and appliances.
Awesome. Thanks, Darwin. Chris, so good to see you, sir. Give folks an introduction about who the heck you are.
My name is Chris Fontes, founder and CEO of Trojan Horse Cannabis and High Spirit Beverages. For the purpose of this call, I'll leave it there, but suffice to say I'm involved with like 15 different trade associations in some capacity as well.
That is a really good summary. Thanks so much, Chris. It is a labor of love that I know yourself, Darwin, and myself all can commiserate over and collaborate on in terms of the thankless work, whether it's with trade groups, whether it's with ASTM and other industry nonprofits that are really seeking to drive credibility and unification of a safe and credible marketplace. So thanks so much for joining us, guys. It's an honor to have you and appreciate your time. Let's jump in. So I put in the link here in the webinar chat for folks that maybe are not familiar with the ASTM process and the standards, the link to the standard that we'll be talking about today. Reminder, if you're a member, which is $75 a year, we'll be going up to $115, but as a member, you get access to this standard and every other standard that has been approved by the D37 committee. And you also have the power to vote, which we'll save that for another episode, the power of the vote in the process. But let me jump in with you, Darwin. Let's kick it off. So, I've been watching this evolution. I voted on the standard. I think it was 2 or 3 rounds, if I recall. You'll give us the details. So this has been a few years of work, and really created something that looked quite a bit different, shall we say, than the first draft that you put to ballot in 2020 or 2021. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And specifically, what were the key challenges that you faced during this process, right? And here's where we're talking about the voting process of ASTM, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, for sure. Well, you are absolutely right. It was 3 different rounds of balloting. And if I had done my due diligence, I would have had this information up in front of you so that we could have gone through that. But yeah, so let's see if I can get, I won't worry about it too much, but there were, might have been able to pull up where I could have shown the rationale actually in our 3rd round of balloting, which I broke down in that case, each change that had occurred from the original round of balloting to the 2nd iteration all the way through the 3rd. So it would have been a great demonstration here of kind of what we were doing. But effectively, each standard that we ballot has a section of that document that's only being visible to the voters. And this is called the rationale. And so that rationale section during the original iteration of the document simply provided some background for the voter so that they can be aware of, well, who contributed on this work item? Did it just come out of Darwin's head? Or, were there some other parties that contributed to the development of this, such as patient advocacy groups, representatives from the FDA, representatives from Health Canada, individuals from NIST, people from our colleagues at the National Conference on Weights and Measures, all kind of contributing, having one say or another, be like, hey, maybe you should tweak this or that, and helping us create a document, which we were trying to be as globally harmonized as possible, which is pretty difficult to do, which of course is why it took 3 rounds of voting to get done. And so that first round, again, just basically was like, hey, here's the background on what you're about to read. And at that time, this document, when it went to ballot, is in kind of long form. You mentioned 82, it's actually technically 81, but in long form, it was nearly 200 pages. 200 pages of label specification to review, which is a lot of content for individuals to have to go through during that balloting process. So also opens up a lot of opportunity for people to negative that document when you have so much information. But luckily, only like 70 pages of that was actually specifications, and the remainder was example labels so that you could kind of see how to conform with those label specifications. And in fact, that was one of those rounds of revision, was that some nice people found some errors in the example labels that were provided. So we were able to correct those in that 2nd round of revisions. There was also some language that people didn't like that we needed to correct to provide more flexibility, because the document is fairly prescriptive. So there needed to be some flexibility built in some areas. Some voters also didn't necessarily like that there were requirements to use certain forms of nutrition facts or cannabinoid facts, and the verbiage used in what we were originally trying to call or during our declaration of cannabinoids for both ingestible solid and liquid ingestible products, there was discrepancy on whether or not we actually wanted to go so far as make that analogous to the nutrition facts as it is in regulatory language. So that was softened to just be a statement. So that's kind of an example there of kind of the changes that went through in the second round, where that was much more, I think, kind of nuance, language, terminology that was used, and helping with clarification. Third round was much more technical in the respect of, hey, this needs to be changed here. We tweaked all of the tables so that they were more legible. We made it so that all of the net weight examples that are in the document were compliant with the with an appropriate geographical region where you're in. Before, it was too prescriptive of so many different like areas of what it would look like here, there, etc. And so it was simplified to single unit system or dual unit system, based on where you are. So that, a couple technical changes there that made the document actually easier to use as the user. So it was a little winded. I apologize about that, but that gives you some idea of like the both subtle and major changes that occurred to the document.
Thanks, Darwin. I think as thorough as that was, and yeah, several minutes long, that condensing down a couple of years of work and multiple rounds of revisions, which I think back to, I mean, I just have a master's degree, right? So it was a thesis versus a dissertation, and a couple hundred pages. That was a dissertation level of work with the amount of feedback and red lines, which, to summarize what you described, right? Every negative, you got multiple negatives through multiple rounds of ballots, and each one of those represented, "Ooh, I found something that was a mistake. Thank you for the catch." Or two, I came up with, I have something I disagree with, something written as it was, language, and you had to get on a call or work with them to understand what they were proposing and why, so you could make the change, or in maybe some cases say, actually, no, this is why I put it here. This is what the task group came up with and why, and got agreement so that the negative could be resolved so that the ballot could move forward. Is that
yes, fair? Absolutely. Super contentious balloting process and negative negotiations, because in ASTM world, every vote, no matter what, has to be addressed. So if that's or every negative vote has to be addressed, and those considerations heard and responded to. And so in some cases, like you said, those can be worked out. And in other cases, with the label specification, they can't, and they have to go through the process that ASTM has established, what allows us to go through the appeals process. And then the end of that back and forth and arguments being presented, we had our 51st standard published finally this year on 4/20. Woohoo!
Woo-hoo. Incredible. Thank you for that reminder that it was ironically amazingly published on 4/20. This is an incredible feat. So Chris, I want to go to you, and I will admit, I'm the vice chair of the committee. I've drank the Kool-Aid, as Darwin and I like to talk about, but ASTM comes with 125 years of credibility. That it's ASTM's process. It's not Darwin or David or anybody's at D37's process. It's ASTM's that provides that credibility and robustness. To me, that seems like a compelling reason to get on board and use the standards, but I don't want to put words into your mouth. Chris, you've been a first mover on standards and a champion of best practices, including the universal symbol was, I believe, that was the first thing you adopted, which I can't believe I don't have a sticker in front of me, but I will find one. So tell us, what has compelled you as an operator to be an adopter and champion of these standards?
Oh man, the list is fairly endless here, to be totally honest. At minimum, you have ease of use, right? If I can follow a standard to create documents, publications, products, whatever it is that exists, I don't have to reinvent the wheel. Right, somebody, industry specialists, if you're following an ASTM standard, it's industry specialists that have put in their volunteer time to make sure that these standards get created. They've been heavily debated, and the best version, so to speak, that's possible with a group consensus is the result. So why would I try to reinvent the wheel from scratch and do all this myself when I have a huge organization and group of folks that did it for me and I get to just use it? So honestly, ease of use is not number one, but one of the driving factors of I need to create a label. How do I do that? Let me look for something. And in our space, we are not properly regulated by the FDA. And as such, you can try to follow food standards, you could try to follow dietary supplement standards, and that'll get you to create a safe product. But it's not exactly enforceable at the moment, which means there are no technical standards for our industry. And as such, and for me, you know, being in the hemp space, that's a national standard that I'm talking about. States have state by state standards, both for hemp and for marijuana. And as such, those standards need to be followed to be compliant with your state regulations. However, when you're a national brand or a multi-state operator, you're looking at, well, what do I do with these labels? We've got a bunch of different jurisdictions. How can I commonize most of this, et cetera, et cetera? And I think falling back to the ASTM standard as the foundation, and then, you know, I won't say gladly allowing jurisdictions to conflict, but making the necessary adjustments to be compliant is a lot easier than starting from scratch in every state you go into. So ease of use is one of them. Two, consumer identification, right? When you come up with a standard and that standard gets adopted, people get trained, consumers get trained when they purchase products. They've like, okay, I've read a similar looking package before 15 times. I've used this product a couple of times now. I know what to look for when I buy my next product. And if there's standardization, they can find the information they need to make a safe purchase decision. If it's wildly different every time they buy, they're kind of guessing every time, and they're likely to make a reasonable human error and purchase something that maybe isn't the best fit for them. On top of that, it's an industry where I'm in that needs more regulation, and it signifies to regulators that we're a serious industry and we want to make real serious products, and we're going to take our regulations, our self-regulation seriously to protect consumers. And this is you know, in line with that, being a good actor, doing the right stuff. When I first adopted the universal symbol, it was almost like a godsend, because we were using California's symbol, and then we decided to use Nevada's symbol, and we started doing all these different things. And I'm like, God, this really sucks. We're gonna have a bunch of different labels, and you guys came out with this symbol standard, and I was like, oh, thank God. I never have to worry about my symbol again unless a jurisdiction overrides me and says otherwise. But now I have my symbols and I have the standard, and I move forward with life, and I don't sweat it too much. And I really think that this standardization is something that the industry needs, something regulators need, and it's something consumers need alike. So it's equal parts a necessity for me, as well as a desire combined with contributing to the greater good, if you will.
Wow. I appreciate that insight, Chris. Well said. And I saw all of the likes, celebration emojis popping up through. So it seems like I'm not the only one. And I just want to add and reiterate a couple of things you said there. One, with the issue of, you mentioned something about like, we need more regulations. And I think, a lot of folks agree, but a lot of folks also disagree. But to your point of, let's the thing about regulations, and let's go back to standards, that can represent a concept of self-regulation, right? Where you, Chris, you, Darwin, the other 700 members, which include industry, can actually write the playbook and put your mark on what the regulations should look like once these standards get adopted into regulations, assuming that pathway happens. And that's really powerful versus, hey, I wasn't able to hire enough lobbyists, and I don't have all the volunteer time because I'm in 7 states to attend 7 task groups where I'm just one voice, and depending on the politics, my voice may or may not be heard equally. The amount of science that might be injected into that and common sense may vary, which means your results may vary. So this really provides a viable solution for a big picture problem. And thank you for mentioning all that. I actually want to jump to a follow-up question for you, Chris, because take us back to before this standard and before the universal symbol. You just alluded to, you're using the California symbol and then Nevada, and you're like, crap. You had to create a label from scratch, right? You had nowhere to really begin, and building on the FDA framework, right? You can't make claims. You can't make it resemble an identical FDA FSMA product or a dietary supplement, because then you could be perceived as actually producing a dietary supplement or a food product, which these products are not approved by the FDA. They're legal at the federal level. So you want to follow these best practices, but not to a T. So that sounds, I'm getting overwhelmed. So tell us about that journey and how challenging it was.
Well, I used to have hair before I started this company, if it gives you an indication. It was rough. I mean, you highlighted it perfectly. You immediately think, okay, I've got this great idea for a product. Let's launch it. Okay, I need to make a label. I just need to make it look cool and put some information on there. And then you start to realize, wait, no, it's so much more than that. And like you said, this is not a dietary supplement, and it's not a food according to the FDA. It's a nothing that's allowed according to the FDA. Now, if it fell into a category, it would likely fall into one of those two. And that's, I think, what the industry generally understands as truth. And so most of the industry, well before I created this product specifically, had sort of come to that consensus that, hey, let's treat this like either a dietary supplement or a food and follow those standards as best as we can. But like you said, but not all of them, because some of them are problematic. Some of them are questionable, and some of them you just have to make a judgment call, and you're literally rolling the dice on what's higher risk. For example, one FDA consultant, and I also had worked with FDA consultants who had decades in Nutra and food that have since moved over to cannabis. And some of these folks are very active in cannabis, and I know who they are through the industry, and reached out to a couple of them and said, hey, how, will you take a look at my labels? And obviously I paid them a fee for that. And they took a look, and some of them will say, you need to treat this like a supplement. That's your lowest risk scenario. It has to say dietary supplement or nutritional supplement or herbal supplement right on the primary display panel and underneath your statement of identity. And another consultant will say, I think you're better off with food than dietary supplement here. So I would go nutrition facts and not put dietary supplement on there. So to some extent, even the experts in the space are really going off of, what do I feel is your best opportunity to not draw the ire of a regulatory agency that says you're not allowed to do what you're doing. And it's chaotic, it's confusing. There is no hard, fast rule. So I think as an industry, when any form of standard comes out, we clamor to it like, oh my God, there's at least a floating log in this pool I can hang on to and breathe a little longer because I'm tired of treading all the water by myself. So it was rough. It was rough. And our labels have gone through multiple iterations. And let's also not forget that this is a new industry. So it's not like most of us are rolling in cash and can just say, let's make 100,000 labels. And if it doesn't work out, we'll just throw them away and make another 100,000 labels. In fact, usually what we say is we can only afford to do 1,000 labels. So we're paying 10 times the price for these, which will come into concept later about state-by-state issues as well and economy of scale. But it was really rough, and I was very thankful to have the guidance of some folks that had worked with the FDA previously, and the wherewithal to take action on those items instead of just saying, if they catch me, they catch me, because they will eventually. And we see it all the time. If you follow the FDA warning letters, there's no shortage of them. And so you're always like, how can I not piss them off and still take care of my consumers and still have a product that's marketable?
Darwin, I saw you came up mute. I don't know if you had something to add before I go to your question for you.
I came up.
Okay. So building off of what you said something important there, Chris, about the fact that, well, you said a lot of important things there, but I want to focus on one thing about the multiple iterations that you went through, even after getting multiple consultants that have operated in the FDA space that understand this. You're getting conflicting opinions there, and there's no right or wrong, because it's this murky gray area, especially to date, particularly for you in the hemp space in the non-medical or adult use state-by-state marketplace. So with the concept of this being going through multiple iterations and going back to Darwin now, this went through multiple iterations as we talked about at the beginning as a work item, and now it's an approved standard. So it's done, right? Like this is it. This is period, de facto, use it or lose it. Maybe not so much, right? So tell me about the idea of these documents being living standards. And, I know for folks that are attending for the second half, we're going to dive into a label spec, and I'm hopeful that we're going to find a couple of flaws in this standard. And by flaws, opportunities for improvement, because I believe these are living, breathing documents. So Darwin, tell me a bit about, how can industry stakeholders, including folks on the line today, contribute to this improvement process? Like what is the procedure for providing feedback or suggesting changes?
Yeah, well, first off, what's great is that it is a living document, and that's what really makes the ASDM process and how they create standards a little bit different than other standards development organizations, right? Like this was published in May or in April, but the very next day, right, it could have been revised by someone proactive enough and willing to do so. Luckily, I have been keeping track of revisions that are absolutely necessary. And some of those were a part of the negotiation process that were done with voters in order to actually get the ballot even approved. A great example would be the label specification provides awesome clarity on what should be your tolerance intervals for when you make a cannabinoid claim or a cannabinoid declaration. There's X amount in my product. Well, now there's a defined plus or minus 15% or plus or minus the 3 times the lower limit of quantitation. And that's based on whichever is least restrictive. And that was done because, of course, as you go down in dose or serving size, it becomes significantly more difficult to quantify those smaller amounts, or really the error associated with those smaller amounts goes up. So with that, you have to take into account those variances. So it provided a clear opportunity for now, okay, these are what the tolerance intervals are. But then for a form such as the inflorescence of a cannabis plant, right? The flowers, the buds, the ganja, et cetera, or the various names it goes by. It didn't clarify whether or not you harmonize to a water activity or a dry weight, which is, of course, a really big debate question that's out there, right? So it kind of left open, unfortunately, that small window. So in the revision, one specifically for when you are verifying the cannabinoid declaration claim for flower, it needs to be brought to the water activity specification that is defined in another one of our ASDM standards that I am dishonoring the technical context of that item by not having the number memorized right off the top of my head.
8196 and 8197.
Because they were the very first 2 standards we ever published. So I should have those right off the top of my head related to the water activity specification for cannabis flower. So that's one example of a revision where this label specification will provide more clarity during the verification process of the claim that you're making for the cannabinoid content that's in your product. That's just an example. Another great example can be seen right here in 1.4, and thank you for sharing. You'll see that it says total THC, but now if you go down to the footnote related to 3, you'll see that it's specified total THC is delta 9 THC. So there needs to be, every time total THC appears in the document, it needs to actually say total delta 9 THC, because there are many THCs. We're not talking about all THCs or a THC. We're talking about the one specific delta 9 THC. And so while it's could technically be argued editorial, I went the super safe route and decided that this needed to be a technical change. So this is a revision that's more on the minor side, but provides significant clarity when we're talking about which cannabinoid is the one that provides your designation or delineation between what is a consumer product that contains cannabinoids and what is not.
Wow. Thank you for that, Darwin. So you just identified a really good one of, sounds like about 15 examples of things that you already have on a list of changes that will be made. And maybe to throw out to the audience, is it fair to say, I guess two things. One, is it fair to say, email Darwin with, get the standard if you don't have access to it, go buy it, or if you're an ASTM member, make sure you download it, read it, email Darwin with your feedback and comments, and he will add it to the list. And when you open up a new work item to make those revisions, I assume you'll be reaching out to many of those folks to get clarity, to get a review of it before you actually put it through ballot process, because even if you don't do that, you're going to have 750 eyes on it at two layers, right? The subcommittee level and then at the main committee level. So everybody that has some sort of vested stakeholder interest in cannabis, which covers industrial hemp, all aspects, right? We'll be reviewing it, and every single negative will stop these changes that you'll have to work through to make sure that it meets everybody's needs. Is that fair?
That is absolutely correct. And I will humbly admit that it is a dense document, and I'll take as much assistance as I can get in that review process.
Thank you, Darwin. Yeah, these are, and again, I just want to emphasize that's one little detail that, this stuff does not get created in 3 months by a group, by an individual. It takes a lot of work and a ton of feedback, and it's the collective members that provide these little details that we dive into that create a standard that really is robust and market relevant. So it's, yeah, especially diving in the THC example is a very salient one today with the Delta alphabet soups out there. So perfect example. And I'm not going to share the screen anymore because the 81 pages of text can be overwhelming to look at. But I definitely, well, which of course is not 81 pages of text, it's about 40, 45, I think. And then lots of images and figures for examples, but please dive into that, everybody. And Chris, looks like, do you want to, I want you to address your comment here you made to me and Darwin, if you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Earlier, I was talking about how, because I'm a hemp operator, we have no national standard to follow through. We do have some state regulations to follow. If you're a marijuana operator, then every state you operate in, you do have standards that you need to follow. And you may think like, well, I don't care if the FDA has an opinion on my product because they don't regulate me because I don't cross state lines, until you do. And what I mean by that is there's been multiple pushes, and I don't really think they're going to be super successful. And there's nuance about some of them have caveats that only when federal legalization actually happens, et cetera, et cetera. But there's growing momentum for adult use states that are touching and share a border to be able to move product back and forth across their borders, as long as they're not crossing a state that is not part of their coalition and does not have adult use marijuana. And the moment that happens, let's say California and Oregon get real brave and say, you know what, we're already running marijuana programs. How much more trouble can we get if we just, tradesies with each other? And they open up legislation that does that. Well, now the FDA actually has authority over your products, and they will have the same concerns that they have with hemp. And medical claims will not be allowed, structure function claims will not be allowed, and you'll need to start looking at the same problems that we are of, okay, well, if the FDA says you can't, but we are anyway, how do we do our best foot forward? And so that's why I think these standards are really important, as well as just harmonizing things from a financial gain, from a consumer gain, and a regulatory gain. But it's possible. It could happen to your industry if you're in marijuana right now. And so don't chalk this up to, well, that's just a hemp problem, not a me problem. It's a cannabis problem that the FDA has. And these standards are really helpful in pushing regulators towards some cohesion.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Chris. And it's really, it's totally an industry problem. It's a consumer safety problem. It's a public health problem especially if you travel between states and you get cannabis products, whether it's an adult use or medical reciprocity. It's like, what is this product? You've got to look on the label and you're not familiar with where to look, and it's not clear, there's no consistency, it's a major risk to consumers, I would argue, in addition to the the challenges and the costs associated with industry. So it's not an if but a when, right? And you can stick your head in the sand and say I'll cross that bridge when it happens, but again, go back to the fact that this took 3 years and average standard takes about 18 months. I think a couple have been accelerated and gone through this laborious process in less than a year, but that's an exception, not the rule. And if you wait until the problem is in front of you, it's too late. It's a lot harder to backtrack. And that's some of the challenges I see us facing as an industry that I'm optimistic that we can continue to get ahead of. So, yeah.
Yeah, as an operator's perspective, the amount of hours and dollars I've already put into trying to be ahead of the regulation curve is large. And had I just deferred all of that until we received some form of a warning letter or something changed and it was required when it wasn't required before, all of that financial and human resources debt, so to speak, that I've been pushing off, all comes due really fast. And if that's the game you're playing, you better have a bank account that can support that sort of expenditure in a very quick way. And if you can, then that's your choice, I guess. But I think most of us can't, and it's way better to incrementally improve, create, iterate, and put the time into these things. So when regulations come, you go, oh, we're already doing all that. Right. So we don't really need to do much different, maybe a registration or something, no big deal.
And Chris, I apologize, David, I just jumped. You have spoke, like everything you're saying is the whole reason why the group that put this together did the effort that they did in order to create this, right? We wanted to create something that bridges that gap and might not be perfect, right? But it'll be good enough to get you there so that when the curtain does come down, or I guess that's the gauntlet comes down, curtains lifted, whichever colloquialism is the correct one that fits in the scenario, right? You're there, or at least like 90% of the way, right? And you hit the nail right on the head in regards to why this is the business case for risk mitigation and why it makes it's just good business practice. But both of you have hit on multiple times how this is all consumer safety related, but it's also information driven, right? That if you have consistent information presented in a consistent manner, then that means the user, the consumer in this case of the product, can make an informed purchase decision about what they are trying to actually put in their body, whether that is for an adult use purpose or a medicinal use purpose. And I just applaud you for being, such an aggressive first mover and being willing to show us, some of the label examples that you've put together using both the hard work that you've done and now with our label specification.
And with that, yeah, I think this is a perfect segue, Darwin, you keyed us up to the second half with our 18 minutes remaining. Chris, do you mind bringing up, sharing your screen? And yeah, I want to thank you for bringing this up. We get to, it's like go to school, go to work day with your colleague, friend, dad, whatever you want to use to see the life of a CEO entrepreneur that does everything, including creating labels in Illustrator. So, and I think this is an amazing way, instead of talking, one thing we haven't done really is dive into what this label specification does, but let's actually see it. So I'm going to kind of turn it over and jump in here and there, but to you, Chris and Darwin, to dive in. Chris, tell us about this label, the genesis of it, what this is for. I think I mentioned Utah earlier, and then there are some questions Darwin's way to tie this into the spec.
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, this is like iteration 112 probably of this label. And what's great though is every little tweak I make, you get to save, right? And the next time you have to print a label or you need to update it, you pick up where you left off as opposed to building from scratch every time. So this label's been in revision history for quite some time. And after reading the label standard completely, there's definitely things on this label that are not conforming to the standard and will need to be updated. Some of those are in conflict with the state of Utah, and therefore it's not actually anti-standard. The standard just says, if you want to conform to the standard, you can do so, by following your regulatory agency's requirements because they are they trump what the standard says if there's a conflict. So it's not, those things aren't necessarily up to the standard, but they are different than what the standard is suggesting. And Utah has some interesting characteristics, as does anyone in the space that knows about Louisiana and the difficulty thereof. There's probably some colorful language when I said Louisiana labels in the same sentence being thrown out in the audience. But yeah, so, you know, I started applying the label standard. I'm far from complete. There's a bunch of different things going on in this label. We have our generic primary display panel with a statement of identity. I've got my ratio up here. I've got total cannabinoids per container, if you will, my weight and quantity declarations. I've got our supplement facts, which are going to be updated to nutritional facts at some point here, serving sizes, our ingredients list, the statement of identity, our barcode, all of the warnings, which, you know, we've amalgamated from multiple industries here to try to make best case scenario warnings. Of course, the beautiful universal symbol, which comes in both light and dark background capabilities, very thoughtful. Directions for use, QR code that takes you to a site where you can see your COAs by batch, URL, the fact that this is a hemp product, etc. And for the most part, this label is reasonable, I think. My starting point here isn't horrible, but there are things that are out of spec and that I'll need to adjust. And I've done some small things here, like, actually, I'm not going to talk about that because I understood something. Actually, I should probably bring this up. So when I read the spec, I read a section that seemed to indicate to me that the net weight statement, or the weight and quantity statement, needed to be basically no lower than a 22-degree line from the corner of the label. And after talking to Darwin and David about this, I read the standard incorrectly. And essentially what it was saying was the angle of your quantity statement here, which is parallel to my label, so that is acceptable. But I misunderstood that, so I was measuring for that. So, you know, there's as we talk about iterations and revision in a living document, this could be something where I join the committee and say, hey, when I read this under first pass, I misread this, so I suggest a couple of clarifying words, or I suggest that we change the diagram that was provided slightly so it's more intuitive, and then that would actually get brought up and discussed as a real item that needs to be addressed. And so using these standards starts to also give you this moment of like, well, is this the right way? And who do I talk to if I disagree with this? Get involved, join the committee, have a voice. Which I also need to do myself, to be totally transparent. I'm not throwing shade. I'm not on the committee yet myself. So as we go through this, just a couple of things that might look slightly confusing to the uninitiated. I just have some guides here that are indicating like, where's the end of my bleed line? Where's my actual label go to? And then where's my safe lines for printing? And that's what all these kind of guides on the outside are. I'll go ahead and hide these now for the intent of displaying this here. Yeah, I mean, I could really go through this. I don't know, Darwin, do you want to pick a section that highlights a standard where I may be either very compliant or out of compliance to the standard? And you can read what the standard says and show what I have here, and I can make an adjustment and we can see how difficult that is.
Yeah, well, there are certainly there's a lot of areas that we could go into, right? And actually, if you pull up your guides back and zoom in a little bit, because I'm sure everyone's having as much, maybe having, their eyes aren't as good, or maybe not wearing their glasses, perhaps, such as I am. But what Chris is focused, sorry, actually, if you could just center the PDP, the principal display panel is just this small section right here between the warning statements on the left and the supplement facts on the right. That right there is a critical part of your label. anyone who's in design labels, who's making consumer products, or really, or any, whether those are food or non-foods, they know what your principal display panel is. So just as a point of clarification, the 22 degrees is actually in regards to the corner of the principal display panel. Where you measured it from is also incorrect, because you measured it from the far side of the label. Though, so now you'll see where 22 degrees is, because the angle is still the same, right? It's just the it's just that where you start the approach of it, now you can see where you're actually at on that hypotenuse. So not only are you well within compliance in regards to what is a generally parallel statement, it's just indicating that there are probably some great points that could be added in, say, a guidance document that could accompany the label specification, which is, one of those things trying to help create. Another potential thing, I think there are kind of points that are generally covered that you would need to have right on the label. If you need to have a declaration of identity, you got it. You need to have a declaration of responsibility. Basically who's responsible for the product. I think I saw it there on the tail end of boom, right there. So you're good. You need a declaration of quantity. I saw that. You're good to go. You need a declaration of cannabinoids. And because yours is an ingestible, a solid ingestible, looking like it's a gummy, you need that to both be presented on the principal display panel and in the form of a cannabinoid facts panel, or a cannabinoids information panel, excuse me, as we discussed a little bit earlier, in order to provide that information. Now, what you've done is you've combined that into a singular statement, a supplement facts panel that also contains the cannabinoid information, which is 100% in compliance. You're allowed to do that. You had mentioned one thing about changing this from supplement to nutritional facts. That is actually totally up to you. The label specification, when it comes to making that requirement, states that you need to conform with your authority having jurisdictions requirements. So if your authority having jurisdiction says you need a nutritional fact statement, then that's what you got to use. If your authority having jurisdiction says it needs to be a supplement facts panel, then you're going to use the supplement facts. And if you're in a marketplace that hasn't defined it, guess who gets to define it at that point? You do. And so really it's you can take your best approach, and you've already done that through your legal review and assessment on kind of how you wanted to do it. So if you've internally decided that, hey, for now supplement facts makes the most sense, then go with that. So that is also in compliance. So beyond that, we need a declaration of terpenes if you are going to have those, and if it's a medical product. But I'm assuming this is an adult use consumer item, correct?
Correct.
So those terpene declarations are optional for you, and it looks like you opted out of that, correct?
Yes, correct. And with the oil we use, terpene profile doesn't really come across anyway, so there's nothing in here to declare.
You're using like a high, refined distillate, so of course there wouldn't be any terpenes in that, right?
Yep.
So then next on the list would be you need a universal symbol. We got that. I think I saw that over there on the left side. Bam. We need a batch number. So
this is something that is not on our label, and actually I'd like to bring this up for a point of discussion to see how the group had come to this consensus of having a batch number on the label.
So technically your batch number is in your label if that barcode of yours is real on the far right side.
But our QR codes at the moment take you to the product page, which has all batches COAs available. Then you match your batch number that's printed on the bottom of the jar to your batch number, as opposed to having it printed on the label. And go ahead.
Well, so the QR code, so you zoom out really quick if you wouldn't mind. sorry, if you wouldn't keep going. And center so everybody can see it. So I see 2 scannable items on this label. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a QR code and a barcode.
And that barcode is a 2D barcode with a unique identifier coded into it. Yes.
Correct.
Guess what you have right there? If you zoom in,
That considered a batch ID?
that's your batch number.
I mean, that's a
And it-
G10, which is a global identifier for a UPC code, which doesn't change from batch to batch.
Exactly, which is now your batch unique identifier. And if you are using a GS1 globally compliant and actually live and active scannable barcode, you have created a batch ID. So you are now in full compliance with this barcode. And that's what's
Gotcha, okay.
intended by the label specification, is to provide clarity in regards to those marketplaces. So this is an interesting thing. So Chris, you have always been just a hemp entrepreneur, correct? Riding the hemp-derived cannabinoids wave, so to speak.
I mean, since it was a thing, yeah.
So you haven't ever had to deal with the pleasure of having a dispensary put their label on top of your label.
No, that is not a problem I've had to deal with.
Right. And so you've never had to deal with a situation where there are now 2 distinctive batch IDs associated now with one product. And technically now 2 responsible parties, because the second batch number is associated with the dispensary, whom is now taking claim over the product and distributing it, which adds levels of complexity. It also takes up real estate on an already tiny, you have used all of this information, right? Where is the dispensary label going to go? Are they going to cover your required information with that? Are they going to haphazardly attach it onto the bottom or the top? Yeah, they are.
Yeah,
So
yeah, absolutely they would.
what the label specification attempts to do is eliminate that by requiring a single batch number, a single barcode to be applied to the label. It doesn't need to be in a scannable item, though that is preferred. It can simply be the digits. And then, of course, you have the option to go further and use a 3D scannable item, such as you have in your QR code. But that QR code, just for everybody's clarity, connecting to a C of A and doing anything other than reflecting the unique batch ID number so that the specific item can be tracked in the case of an adverse event, a recall, a withdrawal, or those typical GMP requirements related to regulations for consumer product goods. That's above and beyond and right on. You're doing like a great thing for the industry in providing that extra information. And another example of standards that are in the works that of what a QR code should do, what extra information should quickly and readily be available to the consumer through this feature, utilizing new technologies that we have, other than what is this required content that is traditionally on the label.
Great. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Let me answer a couple of these questions real quick that came through, if that's okay.
Yes.
I was asked, does my label contain version control? It does. We use Google Drive and we have versioning on. So every time a new version is uploaded, it's retained and we can go back through. We're not using like SVN or GitHub, and I'm not using version control native to Adobe or anything of that nature. But we are using version control through Google Drive. On the serving size being half specifically, Utah has a requirement that it's more than that. For a long time, we had a quarter to a half piece, depending on the SKU, be a serving size. And the reason is, we're not sold in dispensaries. The mature adult use markets, you buy your cannabis at a dispensary. The entire rest of the country, you buy your cannabis wherever they decide to sell cannabis. And as such, I want to be a little responsible here. And when folks buy this, I don't really know if they're fully aware of what they're buying or what their history is, or if they're like, hey, I want to get high, so I'm going to a dispensary to buy something to get me high. They could be like, I've had fill in the blank condition I'm not allowed to discuss, and I'm going to try this to see if it helps. And I want them to start low and slow. I'm a huge proponent for low and slow. And so even though it may seem odd to say a half piece, I really want somebody who's new. If you're not new, you're not even going to read the directions for use, right? You're going to say, how many milligrams is in this? Oh, 10, cool, gulp, 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 gulp. And you're going to eat a couple of them, no big deal. If you're new, you're going to read the directions for use because you don't know what you're doing. And I want those folks to start out with a smaller dose. So that's why there's the half size there. The barcoding on the UPC. So this is actually from GS1 where I got my barcode. So this is a live G10 number. These numbers that you can get issued by GS1 are universal to this particular product SKU. Point of sale systems can tap into that. So when they scan the barcode, they already have all the information for your product in their point of sale system. It keeps this unit trackable. Anyone can scan this at any time and find out who's the manufacturer, where to come from, what's the net weight, et cetera. So that's what the coding of the UPC is for. I actually will let Darwin answer the batch connection to the UPC code. I don't have a great answer for that actually. And the actual label does not contain the version on it. Let's see. The question is, if it doesn't have a version on the label, how do you determine which finished products have the correct label during production? Well, that's a great question. And it comes down to our operational methodology for having different SKUs if they have different label needs, which has been a nightmare for an operator. Because our California, our Louisiana, our Utah, and our everywhere else SKUs are the exact same product except for the label. So we're using SKUs and different UPC numbers to distinguish the products as a Utah product versus a Louisiana product, even if the product is the same.
That makes a lot of sense. Very smart. Yeah, so
Go ahead, Darwin. Yeah.
the idea here, right? And so as Chris was saying, right, he's using a global system that generates a unique identifier code for him related to this type of product. So that that just happens to be, guess what? A standard. It's a standard platform and system that's used globally for consumer product categories. So the intention here of what we're trying to do is help ease GMP compliance with our with product manufacturers and kind of walk them through that with these labeling requirements. So now you have a batch ID number, which is already required for general consumer products, which is now associated with that exact batch of that product that was made in that instance, which again, as Chris was saying, contains all of the information related to that particular batch of product that was made. One of the questions was, well, you know, I'm same label for multiple batches. So they aren't, this particular entity may not be large enough to where they're going to print, you know, enough reels, right, for different, for those different batches, right? So for them, what's more cost effective is they may utilize what's known as a spot label, where they print everything else on the fixed label material, and then they've left space for them to apply in a second labeling operation, a batch number, for instance, if that is unique. That's a way of handling something that has to change every single time. You know, adding a spot label is a very common practice in this industry because we have that. So, you know, Chris again is in a very unique situation, being on the hemp side of our coin, where he's got a defined label spec. He's got a unique set of, or not unique, but he has a set of ingredients with known concentrations, and he uses those to go through his process, which he has presumably validated, and therefore knows that if he uses an ingredient at X concentration using the validated process, he's going to hit specification. so that that way he can use a fixed value on the label. He's got enough assurance in his manufacturing process, right, that he can then do the business calculation to go, yeah, as you were mentioning, Chris, I think you said you only print 1,000 at a time. And so that's, that's a business calculation that you make, depending on, the labeling situation. And that's also really important because one of the key things we tried to do with the label spec was address the fact that markets are updating their labeling requirements all the time. And so it's really hard for you to have a backstock of labels when all of that information now needs to change. So the hope was that in the development of the label specification and harmonizing these various requirements from state to state, international market to international market, you no longer have these various different sets of boutique requirements. You now have a generalized set of requirements that are that have been harmonized across what's needed, and then you can add in those nuances or specifics related to your market as authority having jurisdiction requires.
Well done, Darwin. So look, we're a few minutes over time, but I appreciate everybody for hanging on through the end here. We dove into some really detailed and important foundations that I am hopeful provided a lot of value to everybody in attendance. I want to wrap this up with a few calls to action here to kind of summarize everything. First, reach out to Darwin. He's pretty easy to find. Darwin Millard on LinkedIn, type in Spock of Cannabis. Provide him feedback on this standard. Darwin needs that feedback, whether you're an ASTM member or not. Please become an ASTM D37 member, but more importantly, just go get some feedback to Darwin so that we can start revising the standards so that version 2 can be even bigger and better than ever. We are working on a significance and use campaign to continue to get the word out around this. So if you're interested in participating and funding that effort, which is going to provide educational and imagine a whole half-day workshop on this label specification. So you can walk away being like Chris that spent a week with multiple consultants and back and forth, probably way more than a week, to actually create a label. We can develop a training course for you to actually leave with a fully compliant, conforming label specification. Those are just one of the examples. And then, adoption of the standard. I mean, use it, learn how to use it, talk to your regulators, get their feedback. If they're hesitant to adopt it, get their feedback and bring it to us so that we can make sure that this works for everybody. And with the final note and thank you, Emmy, for throwing that in the chat. Next month, I've got a really exciting, that'll be our 12th webinar. Holy moly, that's a one calendar year there, on July 19th, calling it the Spec Symphony. So looking at building on this, the specifications that labels show verification against that Darwin was talking about. Determine the identity, purity, and strength and composition of products. We're going to dive into that. We've got a couple of great guests, including a member of the US Pharmacopoeia. And if that's not enough for things, if you're around at 1 a.m. my time in Mountain, or 3 a.m. Today on East Coast time, there'll be an amazing live workshop with the World Health Organization, US Pharmacopoeia. We've got Thailand, Australia, and South African government entities to talk about medical cannabis and global harmonization. So that'll be a fun one. I haven't decided whether it's going to be an early morning or a late night. But with that, I appreciate it, everybody. Chris, Darwin, always a pleasure. Thanks so much, and see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Live long and process.